The Copa Room at the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, 1962. The chandeliers threw diamonds across white tablecloths while cigarette smoke curled through the air like it knew this was history and wanted to leave fingerprints on it. Frank Sinatra held court at his corner booth, the chairman of the board in a sharkskin suit, surrounded by laughter that sounded like money and power having a conversation. Every gesture commanded attention. Every raised glass became a toast to his own mythology. 3 seats down sat Dean Martin, nursing what looked like whiskey but tasted like ginger ale, watching everything through half-closed eyes that missed nothing. The room hummed with that particular electricity that only exists when legends breathe the same air as mortals desperate to be near them. Executives in thin ties, starlets wrapped in perfume and diamonds, soldiers on leave pretending not to be starstruck, all of them believing they were witnessing the height of cool. The young waiter moved between tables with the careful precision of someone who understood that one mistake could end a career before it started. His hands were steady, his smile practiced, his name forgotten by everyone except the grandson who would find his photograph 50 years later. He approached Frank's table during a lull in the conversation, reaching to refill the chairman's glass. The liquid slipped. Just a tremor, just enough. A few cold drops scattered across Sinatra's cuff before vanishing into the white tablecloth. Time broke. Frank's charming grin flattened. Those legendary blue eyes went hard, the way witnesses would later describe the look he gave people right before their careers disappeared. He stood up slowly, deliberately, as if the entire room belonged to his anger. The waiter started apologizing, hands up, voice shaking. A boy in front of a firing squad made of linen and crystal and fame. Frank didn't shout. That was the cruelest part. He leaned in, said something short and sharp that made the kid's shoulders fold. Then, without warning, Sinatra's jaw moved in a sudden, ugly motion. A wet, vicious sound cut through the music. A shining arc of spit landed on the waiter's cheek, sliding slowly down his face. A horrible, glistening insult under the chandeliers. The room froze. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Because this was the part of the Rat Pack nobody put on postcards. The part where power got ugly. And everyone else got very, very small. Everyone except Dean Martin. Dean had not stood up. He had not made a sound. He just watched. The drunk, the clown, the man who made a career out of looking like he cared about nothing at all, went silent. Those close enough would remember it decades later. The way Dean's amusement drained from his eyes. The way his jaw shifted like he'd been punched from the inside. The mask slipped, revealing something raw and ancient and absolutely terrifying in its quietness. In that space between Frank's fury and the room's cowardice, Dean Martin made a decision that would follow that waiter and his family for the next 50 years. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy. But stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that frozen moment in 1962 when silence became the loudest thing Dean Martin ever said. To understand the silence that would eventually fall over the Copa Room, you first have to understand the noise. The Sands Hotel rose from the Nevada desert like a mirage made permanent, its neon crown cutting through the darkness for miles. By 1962, it had become more than a casino or showroom. It was the Vatican of cool, where Chicago money genuflected before Hollywood dreams under chandeliers that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. The Copa Room wasn't just where you went to see a show. It was where you witnessed power in its most intoxicating form, served neat with a twist of danger. This was a kingdom built on velvet and fear, where what happened didn't just stay in Vegas, it stayed in the memories of men who could erase you with a phone call. Under the soft glow and clinking glasses, there was a constant, quiet calculation. Who mattered, who didn't, and who would pretend not to see the difference. Frank Sinatra owned that room without owning a single brick of it. The chairman of the board sat at the head of his corner booth like a king holding court. But that night, the chairman was brittle. The divorce papers, the pressure from Chicago, the sleepless nights, it was all coiled tightly inside a tuxedo that cost more than most men made in a year. Frank was a man who needed the world to spin at his specific frequency, and when it wobbled, everyone held their breath. His temper and tenderness were equally legendary. If Frank liked you, doors opened. If Frank turned on you, the phone stopped ringing and friends looked right through you like smoke. 3 seats down sat Dean Martin, occupying a different kind of space entirely. If Frank was the storm, Dean was the eye of it. Cool, fluid, and deceptively deep. The tumbler in his hand looked like whiskey, caught the light like whiskey, but those heavy-lidded eyes that seemed so lazy missed nothing. The drunk act was Dean's armor, his way of moving through a world of sharp edges without getting cut. Inside the tuxedo, Dean was still Dino Crescetti from Steubenville, Ohio, son of a barber who cut hair for steelworkers and coal miners. Dean understood what it meant to be invisible, to serve people who had the power to make or break your week. He never forgot that fame was just a costume he could take off. Into this high-wire act walked Miguel Rodriguez, 22 years old, third child of a tailor and seamstress from San Juan, with a crisp white uniform and a heart hammering against his ribs. This job at the Sands wasn't glamour for him. It was survival. Every dollar in tips was already mentally mailed back to his mother. Miguel moved with the terrifying precision of someone who knows they are replaceable, threading carefully between tables with practiced efficiency. He knew the rules: be invisible, be fast, and never interrupt the flow of kings holding court. He didn't know he was walking into a pressure cooker. He couldn't see the invisible fault lines running through Frank's brittle mood, or that Dean was watching the room with the weary vigilance of a man who knows the party always has to end eventually. As Miguel adjusted his tray and stepped toward the Rat Pack's table, he wasn't just approaching customers, he was walking toward a collision between the man who demanded respect and the man who understood what respect actually meant. The music was loud, the laughter forced, and Miguel was one small tremor away from learning the difference between serving legends and serving human beings. The liquid slipped. 3 drops, maybe 4, such a small thing in a universe built on grander gestures. A physics equation of condensation meeting nerves, the kind of minor accident that should have dissolved into the background hum of crystal and conversation. But when those amber drops escaped Miguel's pitcher and splashed across the pristine white cuff of Frank Sinatra's sharkskin suit, they might as well have been acid eating through the carefully constructed illusion of the evening. Miguel's apology came instantly, words tumbling out in that desperate bilingual mixture of terror and training. His hands were already reaching for his towel, his body folding into the universal language of deference, but the damage was spreading faster than the stain on the fabric. All those people back in San Juan who depended on his weekly envelope, his mother's medicine, his sister's school books, his father's failing eyesight, suddenly felt very far away and very fragile. Frank stood up with the deliberate precision of a surgeon selecting his instruments. The charm that had been lighting the room like a spotlight simply evaporated, leaving something cold and calculating in its place. Those famous blue eyes, eyes that had made millions of women swoon, went flat and predatory. He didn't need to raise his voice. Power never does. He leaned in close to Miguel, invading the young man's space with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, his words low and cutting, each syllable designed to remind the boy exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of this glittering kingdom. The silence spread outward from their table in concentric circles. First, the adjacent booths went quiet, conversations dying mid-sentence as diners sensed the shift in atmospheric pressure. Then the ripple reached the outer tables, until the entire Copa room was holding its breath while the distant band played on, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their king's corner. This was the part of the Rat Pack mythology that never made it into the publicity photos. The moment when charisma curdled into cruelty and everyone learned the real cost of proximity to power. Frank's jaw moved suddenly, gathering saliva with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before. The sound was sharp and wet, cutting through the muted jazz like a blade through silk. The arc of spit caught the chandelier light as it traveled, a grotesque jewel that landed just below Miguel's left eye and began its slow, humiliating descent down his cheek. Time didn't slow. It crystallized. Miguel stood frozen, his hand suspended halfway to his face, unable to process that this was actually happening, that a voice he'd grown up hearing on his family's radio had just reduced him to something less than human in front of a room full of witnesses. The spit glistened under the expensive lighting, a badge of shame that no amount of money could wash away. Around them, the room was paralyzed by a different kind of shame, the cowardice of complicity. Executives studied their drinks with sudden fascination. Starlets discovered urgent business with their purses. The soldiers on leave found the tablecloths more interesting than the war stories they'd been telling. No one moved because moving meant choosing sides, and choosing sides meant risking everything they'd worked to build in this desert palace of dreams and compromise. Everyone, that is, except the man who was supposed to be too drunk to care about anything at all. Dean Martin set his glass down on the white tablecloth with the precise, heavy sound of a judge's gavel. The famous slouch disappeared. The perpetual half-smile that suggested he found life amusing evaporated completely. For the first time all evening, perhaps for the first time in years, Dean Martin was completely, terrifyingly sober. He didn't look at Frank, didn't acknowledge the power structure that kept everyone else frozen in place. His eyes went straight to Miguel's face, to that shining trail of humiliation sliding down the young man's cheek. And what settled there was something ancient and immovable, the son of an immigrant barber who remembered exactly what it felt like to serve people who could erase you with a gesture. Dean stood up with the slow, hydraulic precision of a mountain deciding to shift its weight. There was no theatricality in it. None of the loose-limbed comedy that audiences adored. The chair scraped against the carpet with deliberate heaviness, a sound that somehow managed to cut through the distant jazz and crystallize every conversation in the room. This wasn't Dean Martin, the performer rising from his seat. This was Dino Crescetti from Steubenville, the barber's son who understood exactly what it meant to serve people who could erase you with a gesture. He moved toward Miguel like a man crossing a line he knew could never be uncrossed, each step dropping the temperature in the room by degrees. The drunk act had been a curtain, and now it was pulled back to reveal something that made everyone suddenly understand they'd been watching the wrong performance all along. Dean crossed the invisible boundary that separated stars from staff, gods from mortals, moving into Miguel's space not with Frank's invasive aggression, but with something that felt like shelter arriving. Without a word, Dean reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a white silk handkerchief, monogrammed, perfectly folded, a symbol of the very elegance Frank had just weaponized. He unfolded it slowly, letting the room watch as he transformed an accessory of privilege into an instrument of grace. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that large, he reached out and began wiping the spit from Miguel's face. He didn't rush, didn't scrub, didn't treat the act like an unfortunate necessity to be gotten through quickly. Dean cleaned the young man's cheek with the same care a father might use to wipe tears from a child's face, absorbing the humiliation so Miguel wouldn't have to carry it alone. The intimacy of the gesture was shocking in a world built on facades and transactional relationships. This was something raw and undeniably real, counter to everything the Copa Room represented. A place where cruelty could be charming if delivered with enough style. When the handkerchief had done its work, Dean folded it carefully, concealing the ugliness inside the pristine white cloth, and tucked it back into his own pocket. Then he leaned in close, his voice dropping to that warm baritone stripped of all stage polish. The room strained to hear, expecting a joke or deflection that would let everyone return to pretending everything was fine. Instead, Dean whispered something only Miguel could hear, his hand resting briefly on the young man's shoulder. "You're a good kid," he murmured, the words carrying the weight of a benediction. "Don't you ever let him or anyone make you feel small. You hear me?" It was a private moment of dignity restoration in the middle of a public execution, and Miguel's shoulders straightened slightly as something like hope returned to his eyes. Dean didn't say a word to Frank. He didn't have to. The disappointment radiating from him was louder than any shout, more devastating than any confrontation. He simply turned and walked toward the exit with the unhurried confidence of a man whose absence would speak louder than any speech. Each step drained something essential from the room. The laughter suddenly sounded hollow. The champagne looked cheap. The entire glittering enterprise of manufactured cool collapsed like a house of cards in his wake. By walking away, Dean Martin took all the authenticity with him, leaving behind only Frank Sinatra standing alone in a crowded room, looking for the first time like exactly what he was. A bully who had just been quietly, devastatingly shown a mirror by the one man whose opinion he couldn't afford to lose. The thing about that frozen moment at the sands is that it only looks isolated if you haven't been paying attention to the shadows. To the high rollers and executives nursing their martinis, Dean's intervention for Miguel seemed like an uncomfortable glitch in the evening's entertainment. But to the people who moved through Hollywood's margins, the backup singers, the lighting crews, the coat check girls who whispered stories decades later, it was just the most visible entry in a quiet, unwritten ledger that had been following Dean Martin wherever fame took him. Long before Frank's spit glistened under those chandeliers, there had been a sweltering afternoon on the Rio Bravo set in 1958. A young woman named Dorothy, fresh from Alabama with dreams bigger than her savings account, found herself cornered by a studio executive whose advances came wrapped in threats about her future in pictures. She was crying in a makeup trailer, calculating whether dignity was worth more than rent, when Dean happened to walk by. He didn't happen to do anything. Dean was always watching, always cataloging the small cruelties that others pretended not to see. He leaned against the trailer doorway, lit a cigarette with maddening slowness, and asked the executive if they might discuss tomorrow's shooting schedule outside. The predator slithered away. 2 days later, Dorothy found herself mysteriously promoted to a speaking role, one that required her constant presence on set. Always visible, always protected. She never knew Dean had personally requested the change, telling Howard Hawks the scene needed a fresh face with some steel behind it. 30 years later, she would tell her granddaughter that the only reason she stayed in Hollywood long enough to build a life was because Mr. Martin had stepped between her and a man who thought power was permission. Then there was Marcus Webb, a jazz pianist whose fingers could make a trumpet weep but whose skin color meant he wasn't allowed through the front doors of the very clubs that profited from his genius. One night in Vegas, when a club manager insisted Marcus use the service entrance near the garbage bins, Dean didn't argue or make speeches. He simply walked to the back alley, sat on a crate beside the musician, and announced that if his friend was entering through the kitchen, then Dean Martin was entering through the kitchen too. The manager, faced with the prospect of his headliner dragging a $1,000 tuxedo through yesterday's trash, capitulated immediately. Dean never mentioned it in interviews, never used it for press, never sought credit for simply insisting that talent deserved dignity. Marcus played the main room for the next decade, but he always saved his best songs for the nights when Dean was in the audience. A private thank you that never needed words. The most devastating story belonged to Rosa Mendez, a housekeeper at the Sands whose son came home from Vietnam in a flag-draped coffin. She couldn't afford a proper funeral, couldn't afford the time off work to grieve the way mothers should be allowed to grieve. Dean learned about it from a stage manager who'd found her crying in a supply closet, clutching a letter from the Army that used words like regret to inform and died serving his country. The funeral was paid for anonymously, every detail handled, every expense covered down to the flowers in the headstone. Rosa received 2 weeks paid leave that didn't appear on any casino books. She only discovered the source years later when Dean's accountant made a mistake on a tax form that briefly became public record. By then, Dean was already pulling away from the spotlight, the apple juice in his glass slowly being replaced by the whiskey it had always pretended to be. These stories only surfaced through what you might call future witnesses, people who carried Dean's kindness in their hearts for decades before finally sharing it with children and grandchildren who, needed to understand that heroes don't always wear capes or make speeches. They remembered a man who moved through the machinery of fame like someone who never forgot he was supposed to be on the other side of it, serving drinks instead of sipping them, cutting hair instead of having it styled by professionals, struggling instead of gliding through rooms where his presence could change lives with a gesture. But there was a cost to being everyone's quiet savior, a psychological toll that compounded like interest on an unpaid debt. When you spend a lifetime absorbing the world's cruelty so others won't have to carry it, when you become the designated driver of everyone else's conscience, the silence can become deafening. Dean's famous withdrawals, often misinterpreted as aloofness or star attitude, were actually a form of spiritual preservation, moments when he had to step away to recharge the empathy batteries he drained so freely for strangers who would never know his name was written on their rescue. The real drinking that eventually replaced the ginger ale wasn't weakness, it was anesthesia for a man who had seen too much save too many and carried the moral weight of an industry built on beautiful exploitation. While Frank battled his demons in headlines and Sammy marched for justice in the streets, Dean fought his war in the shadows, ensuring that even in Hollywood's darkest corners, someone was still watching out for the people who couldn't watch out for themselves. Behind every effortless grin was a man counting the private battles nobody knew he'd fought, victories that would outlive the spotlights and the songs, echoing through generations of people who learned that sometimes the most important heroism happens when nobody's looking. By the time the world decided Dean Martin was untouchable, the ground was already cracking beneath his feet. To audiences watching variety shows and Christmas specials, he remained the eternal cool customer, floating across stages with that familiar glass and that knowing smile. But underneath the polished surface, the accumulated weight of being everyone's quiet savior was adding up in ways the cameras would never capture. The man who made everything look effortless was discovering that some burdens can't be carried forever, no matter how convincing your performance or how steady your hands. When Dean Paul Martin's F-4 Phantom jet slammed into a California mountain in 1987, something inside Dean didn't just bend. It shattered completely. This was the boy he'd once carried onto sound stages, the young man who had refused to coast on his father's name, choosing the disciplined violence of military service over Hollywood's velvet cage. Dean had spent a lifetime using his quiet power to redirect cruelty, to step between the powerful and the powerless, to ensure that invisible people got a little justice. And yet, in the most important battle of his life, he was completely powerless. He couldn't bargain with gravity, couldn't charm a blizzard, couldn't use his influence to pull a plane out of its final dive. The irony was devastating in its mathematical precision. The man who had saved so many strangers couldn't save the person who mattered most. After that, Dean's withdrawal from the world wasn't gradual, it was absolute. What people interpreted as indifference was actually its opposite. Dean cared so deeply that he'd worn through his capacity to keep caring in public. The mask had become too heavy to lift, the performance too exhausting to sustain. Every charity event, every reunion request, every plea to put on the tuxedo and pretend the old magic still worked felt like a betrayal of his grief. The Rat Pack revival attempt stumbled against his soft refusals, and the world called it bitterness, called it the sad decline of a legend who couldn't accept his own irrelevance. They didn't understand that Dean had simply run out of strength to be everyone's moral ballast while drowning under his own sorrow. Meanwhile, the seeds of Dean's invisible kindness continued to bloom in unexpected places. Miguel Rodriguez, the waiter from that terrible night at the Sands, had built a life on the foundation of dignity Dean had restored with a handkerchief and a whispered promise. He'd worked his way from busboy to restaurant owner in San Diego, married, raised 3 children, and named his firstborn son Dean, a living tribute to the man who had taught him that worth isn't determined by the person shouting at you, but by the person standing beside you. Miguel had carefully preserved that monogrammed handkerchief in a frame above his restaurant's bar, a talisman that reminded him daily that one moment of grace could redirect an entire life. Frank Sinatra, in his own twilight years, carried a different kind of weight. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, what Dean's retreat truly meant. The guilt of that night at the Sands, and countless others like it, sat heavy on the chairman's shoulders. Frank knew he'd lost more than a friend. He'd lost his moral compass. The only person who loved him enough to show him the truth without saying a word. His clumsy attempts to reach out were often rebuffed, not out of malice, but because Dean had nothing left to give. The debt of friendship had been paid in full. When Dean Martin died alone on Christmas Day, 1995, the obituaries celebrated the entertainer, but missed the hero, cataloging the songs and movies while overlooking the invisible ledger of lives he'd changed with gestures nobody photographed. Somewhere in San Diego, Miguel Rodriguez sat at his kitchen table and told his children the full story, not about Sinatra's spit, but about the way one man's quiet refusal to accept cruelty had changed the direction of an entire family's future. The king of cool was gone, but the man behind the mask lived on in the trajectory of a waiter who didn't break, in a son named Dean, who grew up knowing that real power doesn't raise its voice, it simply stands, wipes the shame away, and walks out of the room, daring everyone else to reconsider who they're really applauding. The handkerchief surfaced in 2019, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed to the color of old photographs, tucked inside a shoebox that smelled like cedar and the weight of unspoken stories. Daniel Rodriguez had been dreading this moment for months, sorting through his grandfather Miguel's belongings after the old man's death, preparing to sell the San Diego restaurant that had been the family's anchor for 3 generations. Between tax documents and faded receipts, Daniel found the frame his grandfather had kept above the bar for decades, containing a white silk square with elegant initials embroidered in the corner. DM. His grandmother filled in the missing pieces over coffee that stretched into evening, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted a night in 1962 when her husband came home from work unable to speak, his uniform still damp from tears he'd shed in the Sands parking lot. She described how Miguel had wanted to quit, to return to Puerto Rico where at least the indignities came without chandeliers and jazz bands. But then he'd remembered the man with the sad eyes, who had crossed an invisible line to restore what another man had stolen, and Miguel decided that if someone like Dean Martin could stand up in a room full of cowards, then maybe a waiter from San Juan could stand up too. Armed with the internet and his grandmother's memories, Daniel began piecing together the fuller picture of Dean Martin that the world had missed. He discovered Dorothy from the Rio Bravo set, now in her 80s, who remembered the man who had saved her career without ever mentioning it. He found Marcus Webb's daughter, who still had recordings her father made on nights when Dean sat in the audience, playing with an intensity reserved for the one person who understood that talent and humanity weren't separate currencies. He connected with Rosa Mendez's family, who showed him the headstone Dean had paid for, inscribed with words about sacrifice that only a mother's grief could have chosen. A network of invisible threads emerged, connecting people across generations who had been touched by a man whose grandfather's kindness had created ripples that reached their own lives. Daniel realized he was holding more than a stained handkerchief. He was holding evidence of a parallel legacy that ran deeper than any discography. A record of heroism that had nothing to do with box office numbers or album sales. When Daniel finally contacted Deanna Martin through a carefully worded letter, her response came within days. They met at a quiet restaurant in Los Angeles, far from cameras and publicity, and Daniel placed the handkerchief on the table between them like a bridge connecting 2 families who should have been strangers. Deanna touched the fabric with reverence, her eyes filling as she recognized her father's monogram, the physical proof of a story she'd heard whispered, but never fully confirmed. Inside the folds, preserved for 57 years, was something neither family had known existed, a note written in Dean's distinctive hand on Sands hotel stationery. The ink had faded, but the words remained legible, a private meditation never meant for public consumption. Deanna read it silently, her lips moving slightly, then looked up at Daniel with an expression that mixed grief and pride in equal measure. The contents would remain private, a family matter, but its existence completed a circle that had been open since that terrible night when silence became the loudest thing Dean Martin ever said. What we do know is this. Somewhere in San Diego, a handkerchief sits in a place of honor, proof that some acts of kindness echo across generations, outliving the applause and becoming something far more valuable than fame. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy, turning moral courage into a performance so subtle that audiences missed it entirely. They saw the drunk, the clown, the cool customer who seemed to care about nothing. They never saw the barber's son from Steubenville, who understood that real heroism doesn't announce itself with trumpets and speeches, and that sometimes the greatest thing you can do with power is use it to wipe away someone else's shame when everyone else is too afraid to move. The spotlights have dimmed and the stages have gone dark, but the echo of that silence still rings out. A reminder that the coolest thing you can ever do is simply be kind when it would be easier to be cruel.